Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Hi, guys. We're on week 2 of our learning. You should have already finished lesson 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to look at lesson 4, 5, and 6. So this is lesson 4. And I've got my dog. He's a Papillon Spencer. He's about 8 years old. Let's see if I can get him to take a look. Look over there, buddy. Okay, there you go. Okay, yeah. All right, you want down? All right, you don't want to be part of the schooling? Don't want to learn? Okay, here you go. All right, so um, we looked at the Civil War, how it starts in in New Mexico, and remember, there's the two sides. There is the North and there's the South. The North wants to keep the Union together. There's about 11 states that want to separate, and their main reason is because they want to practice the institution of slavery, which the North doesn't feel is fair, and of course it's not. And so here in New Mexico, what happens there? Remember, this is a huge war that lasts about 4 years. And in New Mexico, a guy named Henry Hopkins Sibley has resigned. He's resigned from the Union Army, and he has gone back to see the president of the Confederate Southern States, Jefferson Davis, and he said, look, I think we can get up to Colorado and get the gold mines. We can move over to Utah and we can get the Mormons, because they don't, there was a time when they said that slavery was okay according to the Bible. Of course, a lot of people back then who had religious Protestantism, they all kind of believed that slavery was justified in the Bible, which is not true, but we'll talk about that when you get to be 8th graders. And then he said, we're going to get to California, and we're going to take Los Angeles. We'll have coast-to-coast Confederate states, and I'm the man to do it. I'm Henry Hopkins Sibley. And so Jefferson Davis said, yeah, okay, go ahead, set up start recruiting units in Texas and see if you can do what you want to do. That would be great if we're coast to coast. Maybe we can get the North to try to negotiate surrender and peace terms where we are separate from the U.S. So Henry Hopkins Sibley heads down back to Texas, and he is recruiting. Well, before we get started about his advance into New Mexico, we got to look at New Mexican forts, okay? So this is a fort back east, but all frontier forts are very similar. The idea is that you can come to the fort and you can have safety when the Native Americans are attacking. You can leave your house and come over there. And if you take a look right here, this is something that a lot of forts had, is these little tiny barracks or these little tiny cabins, and you would house family members in there. It's not something that would be permanent, but it's a place where they'd be safe. And so the same idea kind of applies in the 1760s. New Mexican forts are really not about a place of refuge when the Native Americans are attacking. The New Mexican forts had two things that they needed to do. One, protect the American citizens from the raiding Apaches, Navajos, Comanches. The other thing that the forts had to do was patrol the roads and to make sure that the Santa Fe Trail, the Camino Real, was safe from any kind of raids. So two things, again, protect the American citizens from, and that's Hispanics, New Mexicans too, is protect them from any kind of raids, retaliate against raids, and then also make sure that the roads were safe to travel on. So they're kind of like a police force back then, okay? One of the forts that was in the center part of New Mexico was a place called Fort Craig. Now it's about a 30-minute drive from Socorro. It's about 2 hours north of, not 2 hours, about an hour and a half north of Las Cruces, which was Mesilla back then, La Mesilla. And this is a picture of Fort Craig. You can see they tried to plant trees. They leveled the ground. There's some wagons that they covered, kind of like a car. You're going to cover the car if you're not going to use it. And in the back was adobe-style forts. And it doesn't have a wall around it because it's really not designed as a place where you can run back and be safe. Because the cavalry that was there, a lot of them were black soldiers, Buffalo soldiers, the 9th and the 10th Cavalry eventually, later on. they patrolled the roads, and the Rio Grande was there's a community real that they patrolled. Okay, during the Civil War, Fort Craig started to build what's called a star fort, and you can see part of it right here. The star fort, of course, was you had this ditch, you had to climb over the ditch, you had to get up this slope, you had to get into the back part of it, and then you had to fight the Union soldiers that were part of that star fort. And so, you know, they started to build the star fort because they knew that Fort Craig was very important for the for supply and also for control of the southern part of New Mexico. All right. Here is another part of Fort Craig from top down, probably from a helicopter or a drone, and you can see, you know, they had these spots here where cannons might have been. You have the commander's quarters here. It's all gone now. It was adobe, and so it kind of over the last 160 years, it's kind of you know, just been eroded away by wind and rain. There is soldiers' quarters that should be right about here. You have officers' quarters here. You got the boss in charge. You've got commissaries, means they had supplies here of metal supplies like pots and pans, things like that, as well as food. And then here on this part of the fort, you had stables. Okay, it doesn't show the Star Fort. I don't see it anywhere. Here's Fort Craig today. What's left of it is just adobe brick, and then the Park Service has tried to protect it by putting some of these concrete, you know, protections on top of the brick. This is another fort in the United States, or in New Mexico. It's called Fort Bayard, and Fort Bayard, same kind of thing. This is 1880s. You can see the Native Americans are living close to the fort. These are officers' quarters here. These are soldiers' quarters here, and these are probably like blacksmith and commissary kind of things. Here's another picture of the Mexican forts. In this case, somebody, a photographer, decided to line up all the companies back here with the colonels and the officers in front, and they're in their dress blue uniforms, and they're having a picture of parade. Here's another fort in New Mexico, probably Fort Stanton. I don't know, I'm not sure. But you can see that it's fairly open, and they are kind of like the police forces of their sector. Okay, so here's the first question that you need to answer and send back to me. What are the two reasons why the U.S. installed frontier forts in New Mexico? Again, what are the two reasons why why the United States installed frontier forts in New Mexico? What were they supposed to do? Okay. Now, at the time of the Civil War, when war broke out, you had soldiers and officers from the South as well as the North in the United States Army. And when Abraham Lincoln took charge, a lot of the officers decided to resign. And so you had a lot of officers in New Mexico who decided, hey, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to be part of the Confederates. I'm going to leave. That left one officer named Colonel Edward Richard Canby in charge in New Mexico. He's a colonel at the time. He went through West Point. He fought in the Mexican-American War. He's married. He comes from Kentucky. You know, he's just an all-around stable, stalwart kind of an officer, and he still stays with the Union. He comes from Kentucky, which could have gone either north or south, but he decided to stay with the Union. And they made him in charge of New Mexico at this point. And some of his officers decided to leave. So he's left with a lot of lost soldiers who went AWOL. AWOL means that they just took off and left. They deserted. They went down to the southern states. And he got officers who decided to resign and go fight in the Confederate. So he's left with a diminished force, and he has to try to defend New Mexico. Okay, so he decides to choose Fort Craig, which is in the center of New Mexico along the Rio Grande River by Socorro, as his base of operations, how he's going to defend it. He's going to be right there. Okay, well, there is, you know, Colonel or General Henry Hopkins Sibley, who's now building an army of Southern soldiers up here, has two options to try to take Fort Union. He's got to get to Fort Union, which is up here, and he's got to decide, is he going to follow along this Pecos River here, then come up to the Canadian River and then attack, kind of split the Union in half here, because Craig has Colonel Canby. Fort Craig is down here. But Colonel Canby thinks that the main force is going to come up along the Rio Grande, take Albuquerque, take Santa Fe, and then work its way up to Union, which he's right. But he also had to figure out what happens if Sibley comes up from the Pecos. Well, there's a drought in the 1860s. It's been going on for several years. The Pecos is somewhat dry, and Sibley probably figures out, hey, the only water source we have in New Mexico is the Rio Grande River. We have to go up the Rio Grande. And Canby kind of figured out how he's going to defend along the Rio Grande River, okay? Another person that comes into play is our old friend Kit Carson. Kit Carson is... he's been designated as the Colonel of Volunteer New Mexico Force. He's in charge of about 2,000 soldiers, and Canby puts a lot of these guys in some of the force, but he takes most of them and he brings them down to Fort Craig to help defend New Mexico. So there's about 2,000 of Colonel Kit Carson's force there. Some of them are Anglo-Americans. Remember, these are Caucasian Americans from England and other European countries, and some of them are Hispanics, okay? In fact, let's talk about some of the Hispanics. There's 2 regiments at least, about 500 apiece if they were full up of Hispanics. So that's about 1,000 guys. They didn't have that amount, obviously. The New Mexican soldiers did join up. Some of them were solely Spanish-speaking people, and one of the regimental guys was Colonel Jose Guadalupe Gallegos, and he is there, a very good, solid man who's going to help Kit Carson with the New Mexico Volunteers at Fort Craig, where they think there's going to be a big attack. Okay, so before Sibley comes in, there's a guy named Colonel Baylor. He shows up with about 400 guys, and he attacks La Mesilla, which is Las Cruces today. He pushed the Union forces out. He controls La Mesilla, which is Las Cruces. He raises the Confederate flag. He says, "This is ours now." And then he sends off some forces up over to Tucson, a couple companies, and they manage to gain control of Tucson for a little while. And so now all of a sudden we've got the southern part of New Mexico under Confederate control, the rebels. These are the guys that want to continue slavery, okay? So this is what it looks like. The north part is Union. The south part is Confederate. Remember also the Confederate, these are the red guys. These are all the Confederate forces. And New Mexico is kind of like up for grabs. Here's a Confederate flag you've probably seen before. Today we look at it as a racist flag because today it's kind of dealt with white superiority. There's 13 stars based on the 13 states that wanted to become separated. 2 of the states never did, Kentucky and Missouri. They stayed with the Union, but they still put these 13 stars in for those 13 states. Now remember also that some of the men from Texas, these are some guys that actually fought in New Mexico. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Hardman, who fought. Later on, he left the United States. He went to Brazil. Here's another group. This guy here has leopard pants, so you never want to mess with a guy with leopard pants. I mean, that guy's kind of crazy. And this is one of his soldiers. They were Texas guys. Here's some Union guys. This guy's obviously, this picture was taken when he was much older, but he also fought on the Union side. Okay, so Sibley reaches Fort Craig. He's marched up to Fort Craig, and there's going to be a huge battle, and we'll talk about that on the next lesson. Here's your second question. Who was the Union colonel who was in charge of holding New Mexico for the Union, and where did he decide to fight the Confederates? Okay, after that, I will make sure you do the attachment that you're going to receive and send it back to me. Okay, guys? I'll take a look at the next lesson after this, okay? Have a good day. Stay safe.